If you're new in town or just new to this whole podcast thing, you're tuning in to Law by Night, the podcast that discusses all things vampiric with no fear of breaching the masquerade. In this episode, we shall review Cults of the Blood Gods, a Vampire the Masquerade 5th Edition sourcebook. I shall present my thoughts and opinions on its presentation and mechanics to help you better decide whether this is the sourcebook for you. Regular listeners will know that my introduction to Vampire the Masquerade was through the cult classic PC game Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines, which I played for the first time a couple of years ago at the time of recording. During the opening hours, I gave a lot of thought about vampire existence in the world of darkness, and I personally found it very difficult to find any reason why kindred would stay true to their faith upon their embrace. They are the eternally damned, and their deity has failed them. Why would vampires turn to their god for stability? Oh, how naive I was. In the game's second hub area, downtown LA, you are tasked to deal with kindred who are feeding on the sick and spreading it to others. You find out that as you complete these side quests, that it is far more than careless kindred not knowing any better. This was a deliberate attempt made by a cult of kindred called the Brotherhood of the Ninth Circle, who are infecting the populace to not only assert themselves over them, but to prevent the antediluvians slaking their thirst on these plague bearers. This revelation deeply disturbed me as much as it fascinated me. As I have said in previous episodes, vampires twist and morph existing religious faiths into macabre alternatives. The blood of Cain corrupts all that it touches. So you can imagine my excitement when the Kickstarter for Cults of the Blood Gods of Vampire the Masquerade 5th Edition was announced sometime in December 2019, a sweet time before the world was corrupted by its own plague. Whilst it's certainly not the first book to detail cults and religious orders in Vampire the Masquerade, it is certainly the largest and most concise, at the time of writing at least. I didn't contribute towards the Kickstarter, for I was in a financial pickle. I did, however, manage to secure a print-on-demand physical copy from DriveThruRPG 10 days after when it was published, which was the 13th of January 2021, some 2 months prior the delivery of the Kickstarter copies. To say the community was jealous is somewhat of an understatement, but enough of me basking in the glory of their envy. What do I actually think of the book? How are the clans and bloodlines of death these modern nights? Well, lucky for you, I can provide the answers to those questions in this deep and thoughtful review. Before I do that, here are the rules to the Law by Night book reviews. I will explore snippets of the lore, mechanics and rules found within the tome. I will look as to how they are presented and easily they are conveyed to new and old players alike. As this is a review written and presented by me, all thoughts and opinions are my own, so if you disagree with something I have said, that is totally fine. It does not mean you are right and I am wrong and vice versa. As with my previous book reviews, I will start at the very beginning, which is the physical book itself, which currently sits nicely upon my lap. Like V20 hardback books, it is a slightly squishy hardback made of some sort of cardboard material, the thick, not the lush quality that V5 has, meaning that this is a tome that will mark easily. Whether this is the case for the printed higher quality versions of the book, I cannot say. Being a VTM source book, it is also much smaller than the accompanying core book. To this day, this book has not been assaulted by my cat, which puts a large smile on my usual pissed off looking face. Similarly, because I have used my copy a lot, one can see the bends in the plastic film that envelopes the cover, most notably across the spine of the book. This does not bother me too much, but I know that sort of thing will annoy people. My solution to this is to purchase the PDF copy, like a sensitive weirdo. Regardless of whatever version of the book you own, I can happily say that the artwork for the most part is just mesmerizing. Besides some portraits towards the back of the book that have more of a V20 feel to them, thus feeling a little jarring, I love practically every piece in and on this book. The front cover, photographed by Mark Kelly, captures the disturbing qualities that summarize the clans of death that both repels and invites the reader into their take of the occult. Chicago by Night artist Amy Wilkins returns, although you wouldn't know that from looking at the book's credits, as her name and the other artist actually are disrespectfully absent. the work Wilkins provides of V5 material is just as impactful for VTM today as Tim Bradstreet's was in the beginning. Whereas Bradstreet's work sets the foundations for the goth punk vibe World of Darkness was aiming for, the art in this book modernizes the goth setting in a frighteningly seductive way. Perhaps my favourite piece of art in this book can be found on page 259, which I know was drawn by Amy Wilkins. When you open the book, you are greeted by a story, as many classic VTM books before it have done. This story, titled Just Another Family Dinner, is very short, lasting no more than 3 pages. I usually avoid mentioning these short stories in my book reviews because I want listeners of the podcast to read them for themselves and not rely on me to take up more time analysing the work of fiction. I break this rule here, however, for I know a large portion of my listeners prefer legacy material over V5 books, which is perfectly fine. The short story here very much captures the twisted fuckery that is the deceptive Giovanni. This story, to me at least, feels it could easily belong in the old Giovanni Chronicle books. Following this is the introductory chapter that details what the book aims to cover, which is the inclusion of various cults both mortal and vampiric, the Hakata, which is the rebranding of the clans of death, the Cappadocians, Harbingers of Skulls, or Ashur as they are referred to on occasion, and, of course, the Giovanni plus some of their revenant families. The bloodlines of the Cappadocians are also included, which are the Lamia and Samedi, in addition to the Nagaraja, the necromantic clan not associated with the Cappadocians. There are more themes included in this book, but that is what the review is for. The introductory chapter concludes with what I believe is a much needed warning about the overpopulating chronicles with 101 different cults. Most cults exist in small pockets of society, not full-fledged factions. Having them pop up left, right and centre waters down the frightening influence of them, so I'm glad the writers had the foresight to include this. That, and they are bloody good at what they do. Pun intended. Chapter 1, Rise of the Methuselah Cult, essentially acts as an extension of the introductory chapter, teasing the cults that are yet to come in the following chapters. This chapter does this by presenting the various written extracts, conversations between kindred of various clans and faiths. Some serve as recordings, whilst one takes the form of a conversation between two thin-blooded, whilst many take the form of letters, which doesn't do the layout and presentation of the book any favours. It can be a little jarring having the various text and paper types across 2 different pages pop up all the time. The writing is good and varied, however, demonstrating that there is no real segregation between clan, for the most part, when being part of a cult. After the false start, for lack of a better term, Chapter 2 unravels some of the kindred cults that exist in the world. The first of these cults are the Ashfinders, which is a thin-blood cult that tries to emulate the power of their elders by using blood sorcery and kindred ash, which is spelt with an E on the end for some pretentious reason. Whilst the least cultish in its appearance and perhaps the weakest in the book, it's a reminder that cults take different forms and are not all infernalists in black hooded robes chanting eldritch nonsense to summon Cthulhu by sacrificing a goat in a bath of its blood and custard creams or something. That said, the Ashfinders sound more like a global crack den, which is supported by their own Ashfinder thin-blood alchemy. Next is the Bahari, or the Lillans, those who worship and revere Lilith, the Dark Mother, as the original vampire. This cult has been discussed in great detail in a previous podcast, information I pulled from 2 older books, Chaining the Beast and Revelations of the Dark Mother, with the latter being mentioned in this section for it is also a canonical tome. If you have both of these books, then there is very little new information you will find in this chapter, which can be seen as a negative. It is worth reading this section even if you are a Bahari specialist, for there are slightly different takes on the mythos to consider, in addition to new coterie types and 2 new rituals to use, with the level 5 ritual, Eden's Bounty, being bombastically overpowered. Naturally, with the inclusion of Lilith, one must include the Dark Father Cain in some capacity, which is done through the next cult, the Church of Cain. Now, this is not a reimagining of the Path of Cain or an inclusion of the Sabbat, but a modernization of the Cainite hearsay, which is essentially the idea that Jesus was God's angel of murder and/or Jesus, depending on who you ask. It even has its own hierarchy, much like the Catholic Church. I make the distinction here, for there has been some confusion amongst the community regarding this cult. More people are aware of the Path of Cain than the Cainite hearsay. In addition, this section does include famous Sabbat rites such as fire walking, which has only added to the confusion. Fire also takes up a lot of the rituals, which is just as dangerous as it sounds. Next is the Church of Set, which brought a huge childish grin to my stupid face. The lack of Setite lore in V5 disheartened me. I understand why that stuff was admitted at first, with the ministry's focus on corruption, deceit and trickery taking centre stage, but that is only one part of the clan, as these fiends derive from their obsession with Set in an attempt to convert them or to lead them to their demise. Similar to my point on the Bahari, whilst those who have read various materials on the followers of Set may think they know everything and merely skip over the section, there are different perspectives to take in, mostly a modern V5 take on what the ministry do with their Setite faith these nights. Serpentis makes a proper return here as well, be it in the form of protein, which the ministry have instead of their unique discipline, Serpentis. I say this for some of the more familiar powers, such as the ability for the Setite to remove their heart and place it in a jar for safekeeping will make older players happy, in addition of stats for various snakes for the minister to transform into. The next discussed cult is the Church of Shalem, which has kindred obsessed and fawn over the abyss, seeking the destruction of the world, which seems to lean more towards Le Sombre characters, given the Oblivion ceremonies in this section prefer the characters to use the ones available in Chicago by Night as pre-equipped powers. This cult is the most difficult to relate to or consider why a character would be enticed to join, which is why I believe it is one of the most frightening in this book. That is the very point of it. They are somewhat mad, to say the least. Mithraism is the penultimate kindred cult, which I will skip over, for a lot of it was covered in my episode about the Bull God. I wished I waited until getting the book to talk about him, for there is a lot more information available to use now. You will learn how the cult is structured, and the influence the the properly dead Methuselah has over his disciples. I know I won't make the same mistake with the Nephilim, which in previous books were described as a Toreador bloodline that focused on penitence but has now opened its doors to other clans with a change in focus to finding ultimate beauty, thanks to the teachings of the Methuselah Michael, who claims he is the titular archangel. I believe this to be a watered down version of a very sinister and twisted bloodline, but it does provide some interesting plot hooks for characters nonetheless. The chapter concludes by chucking a handful of smaller cults at the reader, some better than others. Familiar ones such as the Eyes of Malachi and Servitors of Erad make a return, in addition to some newer ones such as the Cleopatrons of Yima and the Sons of Daughter of Helena, which, if you know your VTM lore, are both as weird as they sound. The next chapter presents the clans of death, the Hecata, unpacking the lore associated with each bloodline member, how they operate, and their grander purpose within the clan, sect, family thing. I will be honest and admit that when I was first made aware of the plans to regroup almost all the necromantic bloodlines together, I was very negative about it. Now, it made sense mechanically, as V5 is meant for newer VTM players. I was, and still am, not a fan of them sharing the same clan weakness, neither am I fond of the Samadhi and Nagaraja losing their most distinctive physical features upon the embrace, pigeonholing them in the lore sheets found in a later chapter of the book. I am also on the fence about the whole mix and match approach to choosing disciplines with Hecata characters. The idea of bloodlines coming together, given how they all hate each other, rubbed me the wrong way also. The Impodulu at Umlawatu didn't even get an invite, as stated in page 143, which is a nice little detail of obscure lore that made me both happy and very sad. However, my judgment was based solely on the mechanics and not on the written lore behind it. Sticking to the cult theme, I guess you can say I have been converted. I honestly cannot find a single sentence in this chapter to fault or a paragraph that didn't engage me in some way. The change in politics makes sense, as does their unification. The Hecata are treated like a cult in their own right, making them really stand out from the other clans, as they should do. So much so, that the chapter also includes even more coterie and predator types for players to use, and Hecata chronicles suggestions so players wanting to take on one of the clans of death, either as part of an all Hecata game, or how to put one in an Anarch or Camarilla focused story, can do so with ease. You would be sensible to assume that chapter 4 would give you the stats required to make an Hecata character, but alas, we move on to mortal cults, which could be argued should belong next to kindred cults, but I suppose the breaking up of these chapters make it the more exciting to read. That said, I did not find this chapter terribly gripping to read. It is not a bad chapter by any means, for it does contain some some interesting ideas, but it is certainly the weakest chapter in the book, with none of its cults inspiring me enough to plant them in my own characters and stories. It is fortunate then that the following chapter is all about cult construction, which I found a very entertaining read. It presents a very basic breakdown how to assign beliefs and ethics, how to assign ranks and hearsays, and all those other taboo topics we usually shy away from when we talk about cults. There is a lot of useful information that I'm skimming over for you to give you some juicy forbidden tidbits to read on your own. Whilst this is not the first VTM book to give a step-by-step process on how to make a cult, The Black Hand, A Guide to the Talmud-Ra has that credit, I believe. This book, Cult of the Blood Gods, is certainly the most useful and universal. You can easily use this chapter for older systems of Vampire the Masquerade and other game lines entirely. The following 2 chapters is about the creation of characters for Clan Hecata, which is very similar to how V5 does it. Chapter 6 contains the various archetypes followed by the list of disciplines, etc, etc. The Hecata's take on oblivion and the ceremonies are remarkably fucked up in their devastation and creepy destruction, with unpleasant side effects should things go wrong, which is how I have always treated the manipulation of the Shroud, the source of power for the Hecata's oblivion. On a related note, stats for animated corpses and ghosts are included, as well as an incredibly basic description of the underworld, all of which are exciting to see. My only complaint with this chapter is that I'm not a fan of the simplified Clan Hecata logo. I preferred the original ornate one, but I can understand why this was changed. Chapter 7 contains the various lore sheets to allow players to choose the Hecata bloodlines, other Hecata related events, as well as some other non-Hecata lore sheets, which I recommend you read as soon as humanly possible. The final chapter is a chronicle titled Sticks and Bones, which I will not detail here, because if I do that, I will spoil it for you and I do not wish to do that. I would much rather have you play the module with your friends. In fact, I would highly recommend you purchasing this book and experience vampire cults and clans of death in ways that no other Vampire the Masquerade book have done before it. I think it is fair to say that, as of this recording, V5 books have been either really good or really meh, with the core book sitting right in the middle. Cult of the Blood Gods is not only the best V5 book to date, but I am confident to say that it has become one of my personal favourite books in my collection. Almost everything about this tome is disturbingly beautiful to look at, from horrific blood rituals to the attractive one-legged woman on the front cover. Practically every chapter just oozes with tales of deadly horror and countless ideas for players and storytellers to use. Whether you want to partake in the eternal struggles of the Hecata or drown yourself in the many blood cults, this book is for you. I can guarantee you, you will not be disappointed. And for those of you that are new to the Lore by Night brand and the reviews I occasionally do, I do not do out of 10 scores because they are subjectively pointless. One person's 10 out of 10 is another's 3 out of 5 stars, which is another's minus 42 out of 100. So I shall rate this book the 7 Knives of Mekhet out of 10, as that is just as helpful as the proper out of 10 score. To be kept updated, follow the Lore by Night VTM Twitter and Instagram pages to find out when we will upload each episode. You can also find out by subscribing to the YouTube channel and clicking on the little bell, as you'll be immediately notified when the latest episode is live. Until next time, farewell.